We have two readings this morning, and the first is from Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, which can be found on page 70 of the Pew Bibles. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The second reading is from Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30, and can be found on page 977 of the Pew Bibles. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Daphne. So, I thought at the beginning of the summer holidays, as we're all taking time off I say all, many of us are taking time off. We've stopped church activities just to give everybody a rest, that it'd be a good opportunity to look at rest. It's been a couple of years since I spoke about this. I'm sure you don't remember word for word what I said, so you'll not know if I say some of it again, will you? Plus, if I'm preaching from the Bible, really, it should be quite similar, shouldn't it? Do you ever get those days when you can't sleep? That's been me this week, just like lying there for hours, and I thought, I know, I'll prepare my talk. So I started thinking about the first line, and then I woke up in the morning. So I don't know what that says about my talk today, whether I'm going to be sending you to sleep because it's that interesting, or whether it was just the Lord blessing me with some really good rest. I'm not sure. So let me ask you at the start of this talk, put your hands up if you regularly observe a Sabbath rest. Okay, so there's two of you, right? So basically, under the old covenant, the rest of us would be put to death. So you two would be very lonely, but you'd be very rested. So, that's a good thing, isn't it? In the Bible, there's a weekly enforced rest called the Sabbath day. And I want to look at it in the Old Testament and then how that translates to us today and how we should be looking at it today. So we've had this verse just read to us by Daphne. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work. The seventh day is a day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. And the Sabbath day that the Bible speaks about was on a Saturday, wasn't it? It was the seventh day of the week. The Jews have always considered a day to be an interval from sunset to sunset, whereas we consider it from morning till the next morning. And they've always observed the Sabbath from Friday evening until Saturday evening. And God created the day to begin at sunset, which I find fascinating, isn't it? We're supposed to start the day from rest. When we wake up, we're working from rest. We begin with rest. In our culture, we usually do this totally the other way around, don't we? We work and work and work until we collapse. And then we have to rest, reluctantly, in brackets, from our work, because we have no more energy left to complete that task. But God's priority for us was to rest, to teach us to rest and then work from a place of restedness. How many people can honestly say that that's how they live their life? The tumbleweed goes through the church because so many of us don't have that rhythm of grace and rest in our lives. And it's a culture that we live in, isn't it? It's kind of projected onto us that, this is success, this is what success looks like. But it's not what God intended for us. The Old Testament forbade man to work on the Sabbath at all, and breaking the law was punishable by death. That is how seriously God took it and how seriously he wants us to take it today. Now, obviously, there isn't the death penalty for not observing the Sabbath, but shouldn't we really look at this and stop thinking of it as an Old Testament thing? And why was it so important? How do we take those principles and make it something that we do? Now, there's two main Hebrew words used for rest in the Bible. The first is Shabbat, and that's just basically stop working. You finished your work for the day, and you've stopped working. The idea is you're busy, you do a day's work, you come home, you clock off, the work is done. There's no more work until you clock back in again. It doesn't work quite so well, A, when you're working from home, and B, in our culture, does it, where we're kind of expected to be contactable 24/7. We've got email pinging, we've got our text. If you don't answer straight away, people get offended, don't they? That we should be connected all the time. The other main Hebrew word for rest is nuach, and this means to dwell or to settle. It's a type of rest where you sat in front of a log burner with your family, snuggled on the sofa with a blanket and a book, my favourite thing to do. The essence of this word is being restfully present. Does it make you just want to go home and grab a blanket right now? I want that kind of restful presence where there's nothing else pressing, there's nothing else to do, just snuggling and being content. And the first instance we get of Shabbat is right at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis 2. God worked. He created the world. By the seventh day, God had finished. And so on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. And then God blessed that day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he'd done. And then a few verses later, we read that he creates man and woman. And then he allows them to experience this nuach with God himself in the Garden of Eden. He rests them. He settles them. And it seems to me as though those two concepts of Shabbat, stop working, and the nuach, to dwell or settle, are meant to work together. As we rest from work, we rest with God. Unfortunately, as we know from reading the Old Testament, this beautiful pattern didn't last very long, did it? And God's people began to be rebellious, turning to other gods, to other idols, breaking the laws of God. They turned away from God's good plans for them in every way possible. But God still chooses to rest with his people through the tabernacle and then later on through his temple. And this is the intention of the first original Sabbath. It was so God and his people could rest together, resting from physical work and resting together in communion. And I was just thinking this morning, I'm in that season of life where children are difficult. Actually, it doesn't matter how old they are. I think they're always difficult, aren't they? But the small one particularly, you get to the end of the day, you're just like, I've had it up. And then you get really cross, and then she comes, Mummy, I want to snuggle. And you're like, reluctantly, I've got my arm around her, and it takes a while kind of to melt, really, and to allow that coming back together and snuggling and that fellowship, because she's done everything opposite to what I've asked her to do. And it feels the same, in this passage all the way through the Old Testament, reading through, it's like God saying to his people, I love you. And they're going, well, I think I'll do this today instead. I think I'll follow this God. I think I'll build a new idol to somebody else. And it's like, God is still, even though his people are doing exactly the opposite of what he said, still pursuing them and ultimately us to have that special nuach time, that time of settling where we communicate with God. Isn't God gracious that he still wants that relationship with us? Sinful, pride, rebellious people, he wants to still be in that relationship with us. It's so precious. So what about the New Testament? So the early Christians continued to keep the Sabbath on a Saturday, but then when Jesus rose on a Sunday, they kind of switched their day of worship, and we still, as you know, worship together on a Sunday, and we call it the Lord's Day. It doesn't really matter what day it is. We're talking about a period of restfulness. And to be honest, Sundays, if you're in my position, are not restful in the slightest anyway. So another day would be better than choosing a Sunday to rest. But did Jesus and his disciples observe the Sabbath? Well, they did, didn't they? But not to the letter of the Jewish law and not in a legalistic way. In fact, Jesus had an awful lot to say about the Sabbath and the true rest that God intends for his people. The second passage that we had was, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You know, a lot of the times, the stuff that we're tired with and we're worn out with is anxiety and worry and stress and thinking about things that will probably never happen, but we're worrying about them anyway. We're carrying stuff that God never gave us to carry. He says that my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so if we're weighed down and we're struggling and we're feeling that weight, that's not from God. And he's saying, take it off. I didn't give you that. Put on what I actually gave you to do. What is it that you're supposed to be doing? Because that shouldn't feel heavy. But we give them to God, don't we? And then we kind of take it back again. But it's having that discipline of when we start feeling heavy laden and burdened, of going back to the cross and saying, I'm not supposed to be feeling like this, am I, God? I'm going to lay down. I'm going to cast my cares, as it talks about in 1 Peter 5. I'm not supposed to be carrying this weight. This is yours. You carried this at the cross already. And so we go back to the cross, don't we? We lay our burdens down. We cast our cares. And in exchange, there's always a divine exchange, isn't there? Jesus gives us his rest and his peace. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. And it seems that God's people had become weary of this heavy burden of keeping the Sabbath with all its rules and regulations, just like all the law. It's impossible to keep. And it just feels like, oh, it's another thing I need to do. Immediately after this passage, Jesus tells a sequence of stories about the disciples seemingly breaking the Sabbath, like picking and eating ears of corn from a field, which seems ridiculous, doesn't it, in our day and age where we go shopping and we do the housework and all the other stuff that we might do on a day off, our jobs day, if you like. Jesus heals people. Is it a coincidence that these stories immediately follow this verse? And no, I don't think it is accidental for 1 minute. Jesus is pointing out to the Jews that they've missed the point. They've missed the point of the Sabbath. God didn't create the Sabbath as a stick to beat them with. It was to express how very important it is for us to rest, both from work and to rest in fellowship with Father God. And I think sometimes we do get the rest from work bit, but not necessarily this spending time soaking in God's presence, or maybe studying the Bible more, or just coming back and rejoining our spirits with the Lord, if you like, with our souls with the Lord. A people in need of rest, as we are, both in ceasing from hard work and being present together with God. And Jesus redefined the Sabbath to show them that it was possible without it being legalistic. So what about today? What are we supposed to do with this? Now, as you know, the many laws in the Old Testament were replaced with 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. So does this mean we disregard all the laws from the Old Testament? No. But I think my rule of thumb is if it's taught in the New Testament after Jesus has ascended, then we should still practice it. Colossians 2 says, in verse 16, freedom from human rules. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. And Hebrews 4:1 says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So what does this say to you? As far as I'm concerned, it falls into the category of all the other laws. The spirit of the law is still there, but the legalistic weight has been replaced by an invitation. And if you can read that, it says, taking the Sabbath is an invitation. Sabbath is a gift of restoration, not another rule to keep. Today we're invited into the rest of God. There's no less need for a physical rest than there was in the Old Covenant, and God still desires for us to rest and says indeed that it is necessary. Now, I find it so hard to rest, feel guilty. You know, if you just sat there and you're not doing something productive, it's like it's so counter to my character. I find it so difficult to do. But when we make something a thing that we have to do, it becomes a heavy weight, a yoke, a heavy burden. So let's reimagine Sabbath under the new covenant. What is stopping us from having a day of rest? And I know the first word that's all springs to mind, busyness. We've just got too much to do. And I know, when I sit down and I'm sat there looking at the floor that needs hoovering or the things that need picking up, and it's like, the tidy police are not coming around today. They're not going to come and check if my house is clean. It's more important that I spend time with my family, with the Lord, and rest my body. Because otherwise we get sick, don't we? Which is how I feel today. We have a culture of busyness and hurry sickness, and it's almost like a status symbol. How are you today? I'm busy. We need to lay that down, don't we, and start thinking we weren't designed to run like this. Our bodies weren't designed to work like that. We're constantly attached to devices. We're available 24/7, like I've already said. We've got on-tap TV and films. We've got all of these distractions everywhere we look. Success looks like working all hours of the day and making lots of money, and we're always attached to a computer. But this lifestyle is detached us from nature. Who gets their strength from being in nature? Who feels restored when they're in a forest, for instance? Yes. Yeah, me too. Because you kind of just reconnect, don't you, with nature and the rhythms of life and the peacefulness and as water trickles, and it just does something within us, doesn't it? I don't want to be a slave to work. I don't want to be a slave to a relentless consumption of media. And it's hard to avoid if we don't do something like deliberate to not do that. I have a hectic life. And some days, the day's just pass in a flash, and you get to the end of the week, and you're like, where has the week been? Where's the month gone? Where's the year gone? Why is Charlotte starting school in September? Where has that time gone? Life is going fast, isn't it? And we have to be so intentional about taking that time to slow down. It's very, very difficult to do. I am genuinely too busy to have a day off, or even half a day off, and I'm sure there's lots of you. I can see Kieran, I bet he's thinking, yep, me too. But God, who made the world, says it's absolutely crucial to have one day a week where we're not working. And if I decide to ignore him, I'm being proud and saying that I know better than God, and there are consequences to ignoring God. So what are some of the consequences of not resting? Burnout. I know a few people right now who are burnt out. We get ill, we get stressed, get full of anxiety, we're exhausted. We start pushing God to the corners of our lives. We can't sleep, even though we really, really, really need to. We get short-tempered, perhaps become a shouty parent. We gain weight because our bodies need to rest, to burn calories. We're created to run out of steam, to get tired. When we're in heaven, we won't run out of steam, will we? We won't need to have that rest. But our bodies are human, frail, if you like. We get restored through rest and sleep. And if we ignore this, we'll end up on enforced rest. Anybody been on enforced rest? Because our bodies have given up. It's particularly, most teachers will say they get to the end of term and they get the end of term illness because you're just exhausted. And it's like you have a week off and then your body says, right, you're resting, good, you're not moving, and then you feel really ill. But if we kind of don't push our bodies to that limit, we won't get to that point of burnout and exhaustion. So what is stopping you from taking a day off? If it's a list of things that need doing, the never-ending housework, we just have to trust God, don't we, that if we have a rest, that we'll feel more energized to do it the next day. It's challenging ourselves that total reliance we have on ourselves isn't great. We need to put that total reliance on God and say, I can't do this. I don't have enough hours in the day. So you either need to take a look at what you've got on your to-do list and decide what you actually need to do, and just give it back to God and say, you can deal with all of this, please, Lord, and I'll just do what I can do, and you do what you can do. So what can we do on a day off, on a Sabbath day? So there's lots of books I've read about the Sabbath that still say, the absolute do nothing whatsoever. I just think it's entirely impossible with children, because otherwise you'd never feed them, would you? And that wouldn't be good, because then become hangry monsters. So we can't do absolutely nothing. But perhaps we could practice some things that will help us to have a day off. So be prepared the day before. Do the dishwasher and the hoovering and make some meals and put them in the freezer so they can just be pinged. Or eat off paper plates. What about that? So we don't have to wash up. Be good, wouldn't it? You know, when I try and aim for a full day off, I completely fail. And I think we can then go, well, I failed now, so I might as well get the hoover out and start hoovering. And, you know, God doesn't work like that, does he? He's a God of grace. We try our best and we fail, and he goes, that's fine, just start again. It's like eating, it's like the whole diet mentality, isn't it? When you eat something bad and you go, oh, right, well, I might as well just eat rubbish for the rest of the week now and start again on Monday. Doesn't work, does it? You've got to start the next meal as your new opportunity. It's the same with everything we do. The next thing we do is our new opportunity. We don't even have to wait till the next day. That's how good God is. A Sabbath rest is a heart attitude. So if you consider gardening to be a work, don't do it. But if you love it and it makes you feel closer to God, go for it. If you consider baking and cooking a chore and you hate it, don't do it. But if you consider it something that is restful and relaxing and you love it and it brings you closer to God, you could listen to a podcast while you're doing it, or a book or something that makes you feel refreshed, then go for it. The essence of Sabbath is bringing together those two elements of rest from work and rest together with God. So how do you best connect with God? Maybe it's reading, praying, walking in the country, listening to music, sleeping, doing nothing and not feeling guilty, spending time with family or friends, or maybe a mixture of these. Perhaps write down some things that you find, because we're all individual and unique. How do you find you draw closer to the Lord? And write some of those down. Just be deliberate about doing some of those things in your rest time, so you don't get to the Monday and go, oh, it's Monday, where did the weekend go? You can say, well, actually, I read a chapter of my book and I did this and I baked a cake. And Sabbath brings our relationship with God back to the forefront of our life. It reminds us that we're fully reliant on him. It reminds me that I can't do anything without him. I've even got a musical accompaniment. And that when I put God first in my life, then everything else will fall into place. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and then all of these things will be added unto you. I wish that meant that the Hoover fairy would come round and make my meals, but it doesn't mean that. But when we seek God first, everything else will be added unto us. Work 6 days, and then 1 day a week don't. It's not rocket science. But it was revolutionary back then, and I wonder if properly understood, God's great gift of the Sabbath might be revolutionary for us today too. Jesus says, I will give you rest. And if you're looking at that picture longingly thinking, I want to feel like that, then perhaps it's time to spend some time this afternoon really thinking about what that rest of the Lord, that blessed rest, means for you today. Amen.
Thanks, Emma.